This is Alexis Hettinger speaking on my chapter for Black Political Thought, which is Our Wretchedness and Consequence of Slavery by David Walker. So I will go ahead and share my screen so I can pull up my PowerPoint. Okay, so Our Wretchedness and Consequence of Slavery. It was written by David Walker, who lived between 1796 and 1830. He was born free in Wilmington, North Carolina, to a mother who was free, and his father was a slave who died before he was born. He moved to Boston, Massachusetts in 1827 to escape what he called the Slave Society of the South. Even though he was free, he was heavily disturbed by the actions of whites around him in North Carolina, and he wanted to move to Boston to be able to get away from that. He published Walker's Appeal in 4 articles, together with a preamble to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America, more commonly known as Walker's Appeal, in 1829 to 1830, as an address to the slaves of America and bringing awareness to citizens in the North as well to the atrocities of slavery in the South. The picture right here on the right is the frontispiece from the 1830 version of the appeal, as there are no pictures of David Walker. So in his appeal, to summarize it, he brings up the hypocrisy of white slave owners who call themselves Christians, and he urges Black Americans to rise up as a unit to escape from slavery and to change the way that American society existed at the time. So the first question is, what were some of the impacts of Walker's appeal to end slavery on slaves, free Blacks, and the abolitionist movement in the South? So to first address this, we have to ask, how did he get this appeal to slaves in the South, as it was illegal for them to learn how to read or write in most cases? So he asked friends of his to take his appeal and to hide it in their clothing and to smuggle it into the South through an underground network to be read to slaves in secret. These friends of his could be sailors, priests, anyone. The readings of the appeal inspired uprisings in places like North Carolina, specifically in Wilmington, where he was raised, Georgia, Virginia, and Louisiana. It did not particularly generate resistance, but it was a rallying point around which people would speak and people would just get a good bearing on how terrible slavery was at the time. So given that God created Blacks and whites as the same, Walker brings up how it is worrisome for Thomas Jefferson in his Notes on Virginia essay to speak of Blacks as inferior to whites, both physically and mentally. Now, Thomas Jefferson has been cited as calling Blacks animals and relating them to monkeys, and just really dehumanizing them as humankind. Walker rebukes this by saying that Blacks just haven't had the chance to rise to the potential that whites have. He relates the situation to 2 deer. If you have one deer that is free and one deer in a cage, and you put them next to each other and see how far they can run, the deer in a cage can't go as far as the deer who is free. In this instance, the deer who is free is the white American, and the deer in the cage is the Black American. So he was particularly worried about Jefferson saying all of this stuff because Jefferson was so revered by white society. After writing all of the documents that he had and becoming president, now at the time that the appeal was published, Jefferson had died, but his words were still being brought up in conversations about slavery, and Walker could see that this was going to last in perpetuity and that Jefferson would not just be a voice that died out after several years. Jefferson would still be talked about and praised for many years to come. So Walker wanted to immediately try to refute and just say how Jefferson was wrong. So the significance of the appeal, or specifically our wretchedness and consequence of slavery, for any discussion on slavery, is that it was the most passionate denunciation of slavery and its institutions that had been seen so far at that time. It was the first written instance, and it was the first widely published and spread around publication on how terrible slavery was. And he also spoke on the idea of sending Blacks back to Africa, which what had been endorsed by Thomas Jefferson. Now, eventually, this would come to fruition with several colonies in Liberia, but Walker tried to dispel the idea early by saying that Blacks had helped build the country and that they deserved their rightful place in society, and that it was on white Americans and every person in America to be able to come together and work together to create a peaceful, unified society. The appeal also heavily influenced other abolitionists and civil rights leaders throughout the years, most notably W.E.B. Du Bois and Malcolm X and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and specifically Frederick Douglass in his 1852 speech, The Meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro, which is taught still in many history classes and has been brought back up into attention recently with many of the Black Lives Matter movement protests. So throughout the appeal, he keeps bringing up the idea that whites have violated the Christian principles of equal justice for all by enslaving Black Americans. He says that they have rejected the idea that men are created in God's image, because if God has created both whites and Blacks in his image, and yet Blacks are less than somehow to whites, that would mean that God has either made a mistake or that he is not an all-powerful and all-righteous God, which goes against Christian beliefs that God knows all. And Walker is saying that whites are just losing track of the idea that God is all-powerful. Near the end of the appeal, he talks about how there is no master but God and Jesus Christ, and that how white slave owners calling themselves master or making people think of them as masters are putting themselves in a position like God, and that no one is perfect for that position but God. Walker says, quote, "If it were possible, would they not dethrone Jehovah and seat themselves upon his throne?" End quote. So he is saying that white Americans have placed themselves at such a high position on top of society that they now think of themselves like God, and they are losing track of Christian ideals. So to be able to explain how terrible slavery is in America, Walker has to examine slavery throughout the world. So he brings up several different instances of slavery throughout history, such as in Egypt, with the Israelites in the book of Exodus in the Bible, and the slavery of the Romans and the Spartans and how they treated their slaves. In particular, because Thomas Jefferson was quoted as saying that Romans were far more brutal to their slaves, but Walker brings up the idea that no, Americans are far more brutal. Walker is definitely justified to argue that slavery in the United States is the most wretched, as slaves in Rome and in Sparta were able to buy their own freedom. They were able to make their own money. And once they bought their freedom, they were able to rise in government and in society to the level of any slave owner. It is quite often seen that any slave who has bought his freedom will eventually own his own slaves, and just be able to move and hold any position in government. Walker cites that there is no place in government for Black Americans at this time, and that that is very terrible for their situation. Um, Slaves in other parts of the world were not called less than human. They were not called animals. They were still seen as humans, still seen as men. They weren't degraded in any way like that. They weren't savagely ripped from their families like many slaves in America were, as the adage of being sold down the river can suggest. Walker asks if there is any historical data, historical writings to prove that Spartans would rip families apart, and there is none. Walker brings up the idea of Moses and the story of Moses in Exodus, asking why Moses would end up leaving his life of luxury, his life of just exuberant wealth, to be able to go live with his people in slavery and in bondage. Walker has the idea of, which is justified, that no person in America who had the stature of a white American would ever choose to become a slave at that time. He also brings up the idea that there is no just and rightful reason for Blacks to be enslaved by whites. In Sparta, they would have slaves that were either prisoners of war or they were guilty of hurting or conspiring against Sparta. They had just reason at that time to become slaves. Walker says that there is no just reason for any slave to be in captivity in America, as Blacks have never done anything wrong to whites. There had never been a war before the slave trade, and it was really just a random instance of people enslaving other people. Let me go back now. So now it can be seen through this that Walker's appeal had a very large impact on the slavery movement and on abolition. This was a very well-written chapter. He was very well-spoken. And I definitely recommend either reading just this little snippet or to read the entire appeal. It's not very, very long. So, thank you.